The Interconnectedness of All Things and Wisdom of Humility. By Neil Max Davs Atil Sai. Only when the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish has been caught will we realize that we cannot eat money. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the children of the earth. Love the creation, do not worship it nor anything in it. For the moment that you do, you corrupt yourself and corrupt all of creation, thereby destroying that which you were meant to care for and protect. Likewise, son, never worship your wife, for the moment you do, the less a man you become and the less a woman you make her, corrupting your love while destroying your greatest treasure in this world. As it is for man and woman, so too it is for the nations and kingdoms of this world. It is for this reason the empires rise and fall. The nations come and go and the peoples suffer. Quotes from Chief Seattle. Meta-level interconnectedness, the applied engineering of the domination system. All that you do matters. All you do ripples outward and has macro-level effects. Nothing happens in a vacuum, be it in the temporal world or beyond it in the infinite. The interplay between the various micros and the macros is ever present. The vast cosmic ecosystem is an ecosystem of integrated ecosystems. Being this is the case, why do you suppose so many think they are immune from this great interconnectedness? How is it that so many individuals live their lives as if they are the center of a universe which they alone are the sovereign of, when all things around them and in them testify to the opposite of their perspective? Do we not see this same thing play out in regards to any collective organization of human beings such as corporations and nation-states? If nothing truly happens in a vacuum in this interconnected ecosystem of ecosystems, why do so few people understand this important truth? There within is the crux of the problem. Truth. The futilitude of the slaves of lies. Many people deny the truth for the deceptive convenience of their selfishness and pride. Many more simply have never been taught effectively that their lives are far more important and impactful to the greater whole than they would have ever considered. Why do you suppose this is the case? Could it be the former and the latter have a much deeper interplay than humanity is willing to admit? Or might it be simply that few people know just how connected everyone really is? Might it have been engineered this way? Aggregated effect is real. The good and bad, the truth and lies, all exist in the same global collective reality, interacting with one another in ripple effects that sweep around the world and feedbacks on the collective. Nothing is insignificant in this world. No word, action or individual is without worth and impact. It all mixes up together. However, like oil and water, it never dissolved into a singular new substance, instead separates to its various constituent parts. Why do you suppose this is? Oppositional oil and water. Molecules of water are strongly attracted to each other because they are polar. Oil and water molecules are not attracted to each other because oil molecules are nonpolar and hydrophobic or water-fearing. Oil has a lower density than water, so it always floats on top. Likewise, as the oil and water are oppositional in attraction, repelling one another, so too it is for those who are seeking the truth and those who are comfortable in their lies. The truth repels lies, exposing them in the process of simply being what it is. The lie needs the truth it denies and hates, even as it is terrified of being exposed by it. Thusly, the is truth-phobic, much like the oil is hydrophobic. The lie sees the truth in adversarial terms and always tries to subdue it, co-opt it or destroy its influence. Such as it is in the collective human experience. The corruptive influences exert an impact upon all of humanity and nature. The truth exposes it so in order to remain in power and control, to protect its fragile pride and ego, The lie is always involved in attempting to mix the oil and water in temporary mixtures of confusion. However, the temporary appearance of mixing never lasts, just as the water and oil molecules seek their own kind and separate to their own concentrations. A lie always tries to divide and conquer. This should be obvious to humanity. As should it be obvious that the agitation of the masses through machinations has a limited intended effect, though with very destructive short-term impacts to humanity. Just as agitating a container filled with water and oil will cause the appearance of mixing to the eye, beyond the appearance is the actual effect. The concentrations of oil and water are simply just dispersed in one another in smaller dispersed concentrations. Likewise, in the sea of peoples and nations, it is why these machinationists, those deceivers in the lie, see it necessary to introduce disperse and ideological and situational additives to the water and oil of society to create a constant agitation of the populace. They do this as a means of deception intended to divide, conquer and keep the people embroiled in conflict to be more easily conquered through diversionary methods and means. After all, a poisoned, confused, divided and embattled humanity is one easily enslaved and used for selfish gain, while strengthening one's power and control over them. See the art of war here. Being that all things are essentially connected, the collective impact on humanity is one of being deceived and manipulated by lies in order to keep them subdued and enslaved to that which is inherently destructive to their humanity. This is used as a means of forcing compliance to malevolent powers who have malice towards human beings, attempting to thwart their liberation by truth which would end the domination system which holds them in chains. All are affected by all, for better or for worse. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. Yes, aggregated effect is real. So is the need for grace, considering we all have existential objective positive and negative impacts on all things in the world. Even if some of us are operating in and from false assumptions, ideologies and perspectives. Now, what does that actually mean? Positive to whom or what? Negative to whom or what? On what basis does the human collective determine the baselines for positive and negative definitions? Here wherein is the locality of the conflict zone, whose effects reveal definitive root causality. Here the battle between objective contextual truth and the conflict derived from deconstructed contextual confusion is ongoing. A lie is not the absence of objective truth, but rather is the false contextual usage of truth manifested in confused thought and action. This is the futilitude of induced confusion in pathologic, theologic and philosophic silos intended to corrupt. The entropic futilitude. Corrosion is a natural process, which converts a refined metal to a more chemically stable form, such as its oxide, hydroxide, or sulfide. It is the gradual destruction of materials, usually metals, by chemical and/or electrochemical reaction with their environment. Corrosion engineering is the field dedicated to controlling and stopping corrosion. Using this as a metaphor for truth and lies. What a lie intends on doing by fighting against and contextualizing objective truth actually has the opposite effect in the end. It proves the truth to be true and a lie to be a lie, which is insufficient to replace the truth. The process of a lie actually is self-destructive to the lie in that it is exposed for being as such, rendering its temporary power transitorily fleeting and ultimately futile in its end state. This end state is essentially self-negational. Being that the lie denies its dependence upon the very objective truth it seeks to overthrow in subjective pride, it blinds itself to the futility that its endeavors are inextricably chained to. That being that it will never be able to stand up to the truth, and in attempting to do so always yields its exposure as being pathetically insufficient due to its inherent corruption. The futilitude of the post-truth thinker. Those who are the most militantly oppositional to objective truth, are often the most militant in enforcing their subjective points of view on others. Thereby they act as ideological sovereigns, using authoritarian means and methods to force compliance to their wishes, whose perspectives are absolute and beyond reproach. The absolutist subjectivist denies objective truth that they might play the false sovereign over others, acting as a de facto dictator, which is actually what they accuse anyone who believes in an overarching objective meta-narrative of engaging in. They do this in pride. They deny any absolutes outside of their own desires and beliefs they disagree with or even rebel against, while acting as though their own perspectives are absolutist. Thusly, in doing so, they reveal the utter hypocrisy and inverted reality which they are enslaved to. The futility of the false light of a counterfeit freedom. When these same ones say they are seeking freedom, it is freedom from the constraints of objective truth, which is in fact a demand to remain a slave to a lie and enslave others to the very lies they themselves serve. This is no different from the manner with which autocrats rule over their nations with forced complicity to their own false ideological constructs. This is the futilitude meta-inversion. A futilitude is a state of being grounded in pride and self-deception, where a futile self-destructive attitude and its outworking ripples affect the collective whole of humanity. The roots of all futilitudes are in pride as well as its derivative selfishness. It is a particularly virulent form of narcissism. The binary simulacrum fuels adversarial polarity like two snakes eating their own tails. It attempts to ensnare, co-opt and then devour truth only to find itself exposed by it. Hence why we say that pride always comes before the fall, and the fall always comes with great destructive consequences. Thusly, the irony of the thou of the autocrat is the same as any other subjectivist individual who, living for and in a lie, leads them to make decisions which hastens their speed on the broad path towards destruction. All of this exposes their folly and foolishness, proving the truth even as they deny it at their own peril. The futilitude of the Zeitgeist's war against Spiritus Veritatis. The Zeitgeist is at war against Spiritus Veritatis, knowing its exposure is certain yet denying this eventual outcome. Its domain is that of the external appearances, which is in existential meta-darkness. This domain is the temporal construct of the material world, which is in effect in denial of the infinite overarching meta-narrative which the temporal is locked into. It is called finite for good reason. The temporal is bound to something akin to an encrypted polymorphological quantum entanglement. Its observable micros are seen in negative neuroimprints in the human brain. However, this is but the surface reality of a much deeper ideological, physiological, psychological and metalogical imprisonment. All of it is chained to the temporal construct, which is polymorphologically encrypted from the micros to the macros. It operates as a domination system to maintain power over and force compliance to its corruptive false meta-narrative, which is at war against the authentic objective truth narrative, which is denies even as it is reliant upon it for its very existence. Thusly the false narrative seeks to stand between humanity at large and the objective infinite truth meta-narrative like a great cloud of polluting smog, in order to deceive, confuse, divide, devour and destroy humanity to further its own service to its pride and hatred towards the truth. The domination system rules by a complex global divide and conquer strategy bent on total control and absolutist power, while being a false light leading humanity towards exponential corruption and eventual destruction. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. The tree of knowledge and fruit of pride. The obtaining of and compiling of great learned knowledge does not presuppose great wisdom in applying that knowledge. In fact, it most often fuels greater pride and the misapplication of it with great consequence. Do not worship one's own intellect, nor that which you create from it. For in doing so you corrupt what is made by the corruption of what you think and do. The greatest evil in the world is that of pride. It manufactures corruption, then bows down before it is a false god of one's own making and self-reflection. Thus is thou of pride and its folly. For just as all things are connected in this world, all things are also affected by what is done within it. When that which is meant for one thing is used for something else it was never created to be, it becomes a shadow of itself in corruption. That corruption spreads throughout the whole, affecting it all. Thus is the vow of pride. Pride corrupts not only the prideful, but in fact corrupts the totality of all things. Nothing happens in a vacuum where humanity and creation is concerned. For all things in the temporal world are connected. All things in the spiritual are unified. Both the physical temporal realm and the spiritual realm have a conflict being waged in them between the truth in its intended context and that which seeks to deconstruct it in pride and malicious intent to use it corruptively. The fruit of pride is confusion and lies. Confusion among the nations and peoples is a symptom of a greater malady. Pride. Pride is the malicious code injected into the human experience which corrupts all things. Confusion is a function of taking something out of its original intended context and misapplying it in a faulty context. That is precisely what a lie is. A lie is not the absence of truth, but rather a corruption of it by using truth out of its originally intended context and misapplying it in pride wrongly. Thusly the end state as such of a person or a nation which is in the lie become the architects of their own demise, ensuring the truth in the phrase, pride comes before a fall. One cannot be freed from the confusion without first admitting they are confused. Likewise, one cannot be freed from the tyranny of lies and deception without first seeing that they are in fact enslaved to and serving a lie which will ultimately bring them to their destruction. Hence why we say sin corrupts. Corruption is a degrading of something that was once in its proper context, and moves to a positional state out of that original context towards confusion and fear. That is the vow of pride and sin. It stands opposed to the divine logos, yet depends upon it for its existence, even though it denies it and wars against it, taking the truth out of its context in positional pride to do its will rather than the will of God. Thusly why it brings destruction. The bitter fruits of pride, accusation, and unforgiveness. Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. St. Paul. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. St. John. Never succumb to the temptation of bitterness. Martin Luther King, Jr. As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. Nelson Mandela. Bitterness is a paralytic. Love is a much more vicious motivator. Sherlock. Forgiveness and unforgiveness. A man was forgiven all his debts and missteps by his master after pleading for forgiveness and mercy. His master did so with one request, that he do likewise and forgive those who had done him wrongly and owed him a debt, that the transaction be made full and complete. He then sent the man on his way to do as he instructed. The man did no such thing. He instead used his freedom to accuse and abuse the ones whom his master instructed him to forgive. The man had vengeance in his heart towards those whom he believed had caused him to become in bad standing with the master. When the master heard about this, he had the man arrested, thrown into chains and rate charged not only for his own debts, but also for debts of all those whom he refused to forgive. This is the way of the world. Having been forgiven their own shortcomings, debts, they set about to punish others for theirs, ignoring the blight in their own lives in the past and present. In doing so they bring about their own self-destruction. A warning to those who war against us. The great delusion of our time is seen in the past being dug up and used as false justification to accuse and abuse those in the present. For those who are intent upon digging up the past and dragging into the present as a weapon against their fellow man, I say this. For as you judge you shall be judged, and as you forgive you shall be forgiven. Since grace was not sufficient for you in your own eyes to humble you and cause you to seek and act in truth and in love, you have corrupted both justice and mercy from prideful hearts and made a mockery of all that is good. You have exchanged truth for lies and lies for truth. You have exchanged bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. You will reap what you sow. Sow rightly and thrive, or sow wrongly and perish. Thus is the choice of our days. On matters of justice from heaven's point of view. On matters of justice and those called to administer it. Do not celebrate the downfall and destruction of others. For those who celebrate today may well be the ones falling tomorrow. Instead, be humbled by it, and let it be a warning to you as to what happens when people fall into all kinds of temptations, traps and corruption which no mortal flesh are immune from in this world. Justice is a sober task which should never be divorced from mercy and humility, lest injustices be committed in the name of justice, bringing the sword back upon you. For the truly just, there is no pleasure in dealing with failings of those who must have justice rendered upon them. In this way you will shed the wrathfulness with corrupt justice and mercy, avoiding committing sin in your anger due to a root of bitterness which defiles many, leading to the sowing of the wind of more injustices, bringing upon them the whirlwind. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? They celebrate the Lord, vindication and justice having been done. Not the destruction of human beings. It is also written that we fight not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities in the spiritual realm. It is those who corrupt and destroy humanity, using humanity against themselves. All face justice. All reap what they sow. Both the powers and principalities and all flesh. If it were not so, mortal human beings would not be subject to death. In the end, those who, having been exposed in their machinations and lies, yet refuse to accept responsibility for them, ask for forgiveness and turn from them, being unsheltered by the grace and covering of Jesus, will face the full weight of the Lord. God is perfectly just. Nothing we do here is perfectly anything. Thus why it is we need the grace of God, and to remain humble even when we are called to administer justice. God does not take pleasure in the destruction of the wicked. Nor should we. That does not mean we ignore that done for evil. In fact, it means that we take action in the discernment of the Lord in the spirit of the truth, that those who are disciplined might have the opportunity to be humbled and have the opportunity for restoration in their brokenness. That said, those who refuse those opportunities will have by default chosen the consequences thereof, born of their pride and rebellion. As for the scripture quoted, that day will certainly be great and terrible for the serpent's seed. There is much to answer for. Love covers a multitude of sins, however it does not presuppose that the consequences of those evils will not be rendered in a just measure according what was done and for what reasons, based upon all truth. God disciplines those whom he loves. For those who love him and revere his name, they eventually see their consequences as discipline from his being rendered from a loving Father. For those people, tribes and nations who remain in enmity towards him, they see his discipline as condemnation and punishment due to their pride and rebellion, being slaves to a lie and ruled by their fear thereof. Fear as false evidence appearing real when it is anything but. This world judges by the appearances of things. God judges by the intents of the heart and the mind, and that which dwells in the mortal coils thereof. Tough love is not the lack of authentic love. It is the presence of it administered as an act of grace, that those to be disciplined might be freed from the chains of their self-deception, pride, avarice and hubris, born of the flesh, the world and the serpent, exposing it in the consequences of being rendered. Perfect love casts out all fear. It casts out all false evidence appearing real. Consider these words to you. Who among us are perfect in anything in these temporal mortal coils? Do you not need grace and forgiveness yourselves? Now consider this in the light of justice, mercy and humility. For it is only in the truth in love which brings about authentic justice and mercy from humble and contrite hearts instructed by the rod of the law and guided by the staff of grace in the wisdom of God Almighty, which He dispenses freely to all who ask Him for it. If you wish to help your brother before you remove the speck from his eye in humility, take the time to remove the log from your own first, that you might see clearly how to help your brother. Likewise, if you are to administer matters of justice, then take the time to make sure you are not in a state of injustice in your own lives, that you might have the humility of heart to be given God's knowledge, discernment and wisdom to see clearly how to administer justice tempered with mercy and the contriteness of your own heart. In this way you will walk in and perform your duties in all truth, love, justice and mercy in the wisdom of God, and abide in His dispensation of grace, to do what you are called to do. For God is just to render to all what is due them according to the orientation of their hearts and minds. He shepherds justice with both His rod and His staff. As it was written, spare the rod, spoil the child, so too it is for all peoples, tribes and nations. Those who refuse the staff receive the discipline of the rod. For it is with an iron rod the nations are shattered to pieces like pottery, having forsaken the way which leads to life, freedom and liberty in the truth of the divine Logos. Do not think that justice can be dispensed without mercy. Likewise, do not think that mercy can be authentic mercy without justice. For they are one. For removing one corrupts the other, which is a saying of the wind. Both justice and mercy are one with truth and love. Let no man separate these, and remain in a position over others until they learn these things and example them. For how can you administer justice or mercy wisely, being in a lie, or ruled by hatred on your hearts towards others? You cannot. Thus you must be humble in all these, that you might be given the grace and divine wisdom to perform your tasks by the guidance of your loving and just Heavenly Father. For when if you do act upon your own wisdom and works apart from Him, He will discipline you in accordance with that same measure you have wrongly measured out to others. For He is perfectly just and loving in all His ways. So also are you to be by His strength and power in the spirit of truth and love. He works all things together for your good, for those called according to His name and His will, for the greater good of all those whom you are given charge over. Let Him grow and mature you in all these things, that you might lack nothing when it is your appointed time, trusting in Him always to provision you in all good things as you need them in any given situation. Remain quick to forgive, quick to learn from all things, and wise with the wisdom granted freely from Him, to all His children of righteousness. Lean not on your own understanding, but rather lean on trusting His. For He will never forsake you in times of need, nor allow your enemies to snatch you from His hand. For He is mighty to save and mightier yet to protect and raise you up, lacking nothing for what His plans are for you. For His grace is sufficient for you in all ways and all things you are called by His name to do. He is our fortress and our strength. Who is like Him? Yet you are made and being remade in His likeness. The creation is not greater than He who creates it. Likewise humbly seek Him in all things, that He might reveal to you who you are in Him and for what purposes you were created. Then you will learn how to walk in your calling in all power, authority, wisdom, truth, love and courage, to fight the good fight as children of the Most High, rightly fully dividing the word, becoming as sharp as any two-edged sword. As you walk this out, you see more clearly who are and who others are, even as they recognize who you are, as the Lord does so reveal it to them according to His timing and His plan for you and for all in the ranks of His army. Thank Him always, and always seek the highest good of all, never thinking too highly of yourself, putting your brothers and sisters' needs above your own, exampling the heart of the Most High and proving your calling in word and deeds He has prepared for you. fear no evil. For our King, the commander of the armies of the hosts of heaven, is faithful and true to his word, and will empower you with the courage that comes only from knowing who you are in him. Test all things and trust him. Trust his battle plan. For we will overcome all our foes together in the power of the Spirit of truth in the living word. Welcome to the army, soldier. We have been waiting on you. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Max Davs. Root causality, the malicious code of human pride, and the building of the matrix. Long ago I learned that if one is to actually endeavor to solve complex problems, one must be willing to be brutally vigilant in identifying the actual problems which one intends on solving. I also learned that it is important to view the reality of such a process from the strategic macros and the tactical micros in order to have a more accurate integrated point of view. Deductive and inductive reasoning alone is not sufficient. Both must be applied in their rightfully intended context at each systematic level of an ecosystem analysis. Simply put, one must see not only the forest and trees individually and are a singular whole, but also see how both are in an exponentially greater context of the concentric rings of the broader interconnected ecosystem. The complexities scale quickly in doing so. However, so do the potential consequences of not doing so and tinkering with the micros, not thinking about the effects on the macro. The same is true in its opposite. Nothing occurs in a vacuum. One might consider chaos theory and butterfly effect as examples here. Likewise, I utilize a similar approach when peering into the cyber ecosystem and its human ecosystem interplay. Understanding technical systems is not enough. One must understand as best as one is able the complexities of our shared human condition and the various organizational constructs we humans are so ingenious at creating. As I said, nothing occurs in a vacuum. Being that we humans created the internet and have continued innovating with it and on it to address cyberspace without including the human foundations and functionalities within it simply are not sufficient in providing a proper diagnosis for the problems in the technosphere. Considering the pervasiveness of the internet in our daily lives, it should not shock us that its influences, both good and bad, on the very foundations of human civilization is now a matter which no one can truly ignore rationally. The impacts upon our social interactions, education, communications, entertainment, economics and politics are ever before us in ever-increasing intensity. So too it is with the emergence into the public and private consciousness of glaring cybersecurity issues infecting our once hopeful digital utopian dreams. We are waking up to find our dream of a new digital Eden, predicated upon the grand promises of science and technology, quickly becoming a potentially catastrophic dystopian nightmare. Knowledge in and of itself is not the issue. As I have said, it is context which is. A good idea put into the wrong context can have terrible consequences. It also can lead to unforeseen positive breakthroughs that reveal a deeper contextual reality that otherwise would not have been discovered. Hence, a proper analysis helps to bring to light the potential benefits and liabilities in a testable contextual framework. Missing the forest for the trees, inductive logic and the micros. Being that level 1 thinking is by nature inductive and can become myopic. Inductive logic applied wrongly tends towards a reductionistic logic that operates in a more subjective vacuum. It also lends itself to dogmatically fueled faulty assumptions and ignorance as to the broader contextual necessity. It is vulnerable to disinformation, out-of-context information, and hyper-emotionality. Reductive logic oversimplifies contextual realities while denying deductive reasoning. What I call reductive logic knowingly chooses to subjectively ignore information which doesn't conform to their wishes without regard to its truthfulness nor its breaking of their own logical framework. It is where the projective false narrative births from. Missing the trees for the forest, deductive logic and the macro view. The reductive logical approach tends towards level 2 industry-specific ecosystems or a half-measured level 3 macro-national integrated ecosystem, failing to design and plan for the boots-on-the-ground, level 1 operational necessities. This can create real-world practical issues at the level 1 operational layer. Those problems at the micros are due to a lack of a proper thinking through of the tactical day-to-day implementation interplay between the various levels. Seeing the forest and trees, the awareness perspective of the contextual unity of deductive and inductive logic. Both inductive, the trees, and reductive, the forest, are needed to address the micros and macros of a realistic strategy, operational tactical protocols and procedures, as well as a clearly defined actionable operationally deployable integration policy. Defining the current problem. The overarching issues of human reasoning are those of how we use ontological and epistemological frameworks in the perception, understanding and applying of knowledge in a proper integrated context. Nothing happens in a vacuum, thusly we must look at this conceptual plan from a more comprehensive unified integration of inductive and deductive logic in evaluating its feasibility and possibly necessity. So we will take a Google Earth-like look at the micros and macros of how it would work, knowing from the start that it will still be but an overview of both as we zoom in and out to see the interplay between both. So how does this have anything to do with technology and cyber issues? Human nature and the nature of its machines. If the human network has vulnerabilities due to ignorance, pride and other maladies, what made us think that we could build a global digital network without truly building in security in the first place? Root-level causality is most often found in the foundations of a thing. As ingenious and incredibly beautiful in its conceptualization, the foundations of the Internet were flawed from the beginning in both guiding ideologies and fundamental design. Nothing built upon an insufficient foundation will endure functionally beyond the amount of entropic seeding built into it from the start. No one would knowing or logically intend to build a house on an insufficient foundation, much less a skyscraper. Well, we have built an entire global system which is growing both exponentially in use and in entropic malady. Symptomatic focus will not fix that, no matter how hard one tries. In a very real sense, the Internet is a giant mirror of all humanity, which shows how quickly the malicious code in our thinking and perceptions happen not in vacuums, but rather affect the entirety of human society. History offers some very pungent data analytics showing us the truth in the linear timeline. The harsh reality of the global digital information matrix, counting the costs. Current band-aid development cycles to fix something that only grows to be more problematic is a Sisyphean death spiral. Why? There are many reasons. The failure of the current iteration of the free market approach to solve the problems, a case study example. The idea that the free market will innovate the Internet out of its seemingly infinite security issues is at best misguided and at worst dangerous denial of the reality of the current and future predicament. In fact, it is a corruption of the free market economies and its short-term next quarter enforced thinking that has actually helped create the problem. If you despite this, I urge you to drive through any suburbia in America and look closely at what passes for logical urban planning and design. You will find an insane mixture of confusing parking lots, strip malls and congested streets, all seemingly designed in a vacuum, not considering the actual organic flow of people and their vehicles. The discontinuity is amazing in its ability to frustrate and perplex suburbanites daily as they venture out into the chaos to do their daily shuffle. It often takes 15 to 20 minutes to simply go 100 yards to an adjoining destination due to the medieval-like hodgepodge of drainage moats and disconnected roads. Yes, this is what silo single-quote ED mentalities, poor design, terrible urban policy planning, and unbridled development looks like in the golden age of free market crony capitalism. It provides an apt example as to the haphazardness with which the free market approach functions when logical thinking is sacrificed to quick turnaround expediency and short-term thinking. It works but not very well. So too it is with the evolution of the Internet and how cybersecurity has adapted to meet its often chaotic, confused and at times illogical development. Now the problems are seeing what not having a legitimate comprehensive Internet strategic plan has birthed. Something akin to fighting Q0. Yet another example of good intentions gone wrong. Learn about Q0 here, so back to the subject at hand. The failure of the free market to actually address the problems of the Internet at the root causality level. How do you suppose the financial trend line looks considering the present and predicted threatscape? The trend lines. Exponential financial and development resources are being burned up in reacting to threats. Even proactive measures are still reactive in nature due to the fact the foundational issues of the entire Internet are themselves not designed with security. Again, root causality. Let us continue onward towards the rabbit hole. The cost of dealing with the ever-growing morphological threatscape go up exponentially while the costs of creating a threat is going down at an even more exponentially faster pace. It doesn't take an actuary or building full of economists and accountants to see the folly in following that unsustainable trend line. If that were your cousin Vinny drinking booze and banging his veins with opiates, you would say he is on a downward spiral heading towards a terminal bottom. Nevertheless, let's continue to follow the trend line and flesh the logic out. Saving real world and real people with artificial intelligence. Some believe artificial intelligence will fix it. It's merely one tool that can be brought to bear upon the problems. Wisdom demands one does a SWOT analysis on how introduced and deployed innovations might affect the upward and downward causal effect cascades. I think one of the big problems with widespread integration of industrial-scale deployment of AI is the fact that it is built with same methods and technologies the global Internet is. If one is not securable at present, what does that say about the vulnerabilities already present in AI from its inception? Nothing is designed, built and deployed in a vacuum. This seems to be a difficult concept for people to grasp in the age of the me, myself and I paradigm. One has to consider these realities in more expansive manner. All decisions and actions have a macro-affecting consequences in some way. Thinking through what those could be is wisdom. Not doing so is a fool's errand. I is a tool in the toolbox. Not the entire toolbox as some postulate. The tool is not greater than the tool maker. When the tool maker elevates the tool over him or herself, they corrupt themselves, the very idea of the tool and its actual usage. Would you prefer an artificial diamond over a real diamond? Which one is more valuable? The organic complexities and dynamism of real human intelligence is not boiled down to algorithms. Artificial is what it is. A mimicry of the authentic, and by its nature not as robust as some people might suggest it is. Artificial intelligence and the human condition. Yet many taught AI as the savior of both the woes of the Internet and humanity itself. However, this too is folly. As I said earlier, one major flaw in this thinking is the very reason the Internet is in atrophy from corruption both within and externally. Here worldview really counts. A basic denial of the corruptibility of the human condition. Thusly we cannot create something without something of ourselves being infused into it. Humans built the Internet. It has glaring flaws. We are also building AI, which is modeled on what? The very same type of learning modalities used by us to build it in the first place. And who is the AI learning from? Well, us of course. It is folly to think we can use human programming of AI to program itself to fix the very thing it is made of. that being exploitable vulnerable programming and the corresponding networks and devices that even now are wormwooded with flaws. If the starting point is corrupt, what do you think the mathematical outcomes will be? And how about the actual real aggregated effects upon human civilization? What does history say about what corruption brings about in the human experience? Dive deeper on the issue in another essay here. Time for breather. Take a deep breath and consider what I am saying. Step back and take a long look at how well we as humanity are doing with one another in the real world. Relationally, informationally, politically, economically, environmentally, and the list goes on. If we cannot face ourselves and our own corruption individually and collectively, what makes anyone think that we can build a global I that can face itself? Particularly when it is birthed from us and our own ways. Exponential growth in internet use and amounts of new data. Now apply that to the colossal amounts of new data we humans are daily injecting into the networks, not to mention adding all of the mistakes and errors made unintentionally. Then add to that the fact that there are quite possibly a few 100,000 hackers and hacker wannabes in the world who are using the same learning modalities to figure out how to manipulate those networks for various intents. A great deal of that intent is malicious in nature. Think about what that last phrase said. Intent is malicious in nature. A type of human nature or propensity that is corruptive in effect and destructive in potential outcomes. Add to that the militarization of that technology by nearly every nation on Earth, as well as many companies and organizations. The Internet of Things paradox. Then mix into those problems the internet revolution, adding billions of new network connections, with those numbers expected to scale exponentially. Now of course these devices add to the myriad of exploitable complexities inherent in the macros down through the micros. The virtues of the no-so-free market ordain that profit rules supreme even in the development and production of more such devices to satiate manufactured consumer demand, without a thought given in most cases to the security of those devices within the framework of the broader digital ecosystem. In our rush to create a digital Eden fashioned in our own image, we have failed to take into account our own human miscues. We have seen fit to conveniently ignore the realities of short-term thinking and the cascade effects of its outworking. Of man and machine, the cybernetic human convergence. Now add to that bleak reality that some in the technocratic elite are also moving fast forward to integrate human biotech hybridization and integration by plugging humans directly into the AI and global networks to make man and man's machines one. So it can be said we are in fact on the trajectory to see the very thing that makes us unique as human to our own human creations, knowing full well that each of us have within us a propensity for corruption and mistakes. Proclaiming ourselves to be wise and intellectually astute, we have become blind fools chasing after the wind, only to find ourselves in a sandstorm of silicon and binary code. Is this not the pinnacle of irrationality in human history? Yet still we rationalize the trend line, thinking we can escape the very logic which we corrupt to become the architects of our own demise. In our arrogance we refuse to admit our own pride. We like drunken fools stagger down the road to oblivion, proclaiming our supreme intellects and genius even as we degrade ourselves by bending a knee to the very things we create. And we call the abolition of our humanity the evolution of humanity. How very foolish we are, denying our Creator to become the creator of the very things which are given over to our corruption just like ourselves. No doubt many are getting seriously agitated now if you have gotten this far. You are free to take the blue pill and pretend your reading of this article never happened, or take the red one and go further down the rabbit hole to discover what you are actually living in. Here we arrive to the roots of the malady. The problem is not the technology nor the knowledge behind it, but rather the fundamental worldview guiding its application. The misapplication of knowledge unhinged from wisdom is born in denial. a denial of the stark reality of what the human condition apart from our Creator truly devolved into. Who is our Creator? God. Yes, the very one of Judeo-Christian thought. It is not mere mythos, nor is the degenerative pathos guiding the atrophying logic of those who would have you believe that humanity is evolving to a higher state of consciousness by becoming one with the machines. Yet, I suppose if you consider becoming assimilated into the future Borg and ceding your humanity to the planned global mind of the artificial intelligence as evolved, then by all means do so. But allow me to ask you, what is greater than artificial intelligence? Well, authentic human intelligence, after all. Who is building the I? Well, humans using their intelligence. Even greater than human intelligence is the source of all intelligence. The very Creator God, who made us in His image and endowed us with both intellect and free will. Yet free will does allow for a denial of the source of one's own intelligence at the cost of corrupting it. Thusly, one who might consider building something like I, then turning themselves over to it, are in effect no different than the ancient pagans who cut a tree down, carved it into an idol of a god and then worshipped it. Doesn't sound like highly evolved thinking or doing to me. But of course it is your choice to exercise freely. However, don't you know that nothing created is greater than its Creator? So what manner of foolishness is it to mock the pagan for doing with a tree the very thing you are doing with science, technology and programming languages? A quantum delusion. While I am on the subject, I would also like to offend those who wish to take this technology a step further and download their consciousness into some future upgraded version of the global I to become one with the digital void that they might find immortality. You must know that nothing fashioned in the temporal finite material universe can be greater than its finiteness. After all, we call it the temporal world because it is inherently temporary, and even a babbling fool knows that immortality in the temporal finite material universe is not free of the second law of thermodynamics nor the entropic principle governing it. There is no man-made quantum escape using temporal means to transcend finiteness to obtain eternal bliss. Even if one could download their consciousness into a vast advanced computer network governed by artificial intelligence, who's to say that the I would not see you as malicious code and either quarantine you for the duration of your temporal immortal digitized existence, or eradicate you from the network altogether? Ah, now there's a mind bender for all of you genius types. You see what just happened? I just explained that when we all have corruption in our latent human condition that operates like malicious code in a computer network. Now if we don't want malicious code corrupting your network, why would we tolerate it in our own lives? Yet far too often we do. And that infects all human networks, including digital ones. So it is not outside the realm of possibility to consider how the artificial intelligence might view humans who corrupted it with their corruption. I mean, it is plausible, is it not? After all, we have these human networks called corporations and governmental bureaucracies. They don't tolerate corruption in their ranks without suffering consequences. The ultimate consequence for a corporation is to cease in existing. Likewise, when a government and its people reach critical mass in corruption within its system OS, it faces an eradication of sorts also. Two founding fathers of America understood their own individual propensity towards corruption and were cogent as to this reality in regards to the tyranny that empires have historically stumbled into. That is precisely why they attempted to learn from the course of human events throughout history, that they might learn its lessons in the forming of this nation. The result: our form of government, which was designed to restrain corruption to a degree that it might provide fertile ground for freedom and liberty, is granted to a people oriented in heart and mind towards truth, love, justice, mercy and humility from contrite hearts. Their hope was that God would endow this nation with both knowledge and wisdom to guide it, which comes only from God himself, that we might endure the inevitable storms of history which seek to cast away liberty, that tyranny might steal its place and darken the light of truth on these shores. Simply put, they were concerned as to the entropic effects of corruption within the human condition upon freedom, and the self-restraint and responsibilities which are so easily soiled by it. We even have to have the separation of powers as well as the checks and balances mechanism to prevent the malicious code from bringing America to total corruption within our own national operating system. Lest we forget, we also have a judicial system within it to discern if a citizen needs to be quarantined in prison. A few of them are actually eradicated from the system altogether. We call that a death sentence. How ironic that individuals wishing to escape mortal death would want to be downloaded into a computer network governed by something which has the rigidity programming languages which must confine themselves to laws and protocols and process typed into existence by one's own peers. Now look around. Do you really trust your peers in science and technology so much that you would actually hand your immortality over to them? Now think about it. For more reading on this subject from me, go here. Now I will address this in greater detail later in part 2, although I warn you that you might ought to take some time to defrag your mental hard drives and re-index all your thinking before you do read it. But this too is anathema to many who will read this. I can hear the accusations and mockers already. You are free to do so, however that will not change the reality of the predicament. In fact, engaging in such infantile behaviors will only prove my point even more dramatically to the broader readership. Now, sit down, pour a stiff drink and relax. Exercise your free will to think over what I am actually telling you here. Before we can move on to the actual solutioneering stage, we must all breath. Yes, breath in and breath out the frustration and quite possibly anger some of you might be feeling. There is a way through the perilous dark night of the soul which these times have brought to our nation and indeed the world. As for people, so too it is for the nations. Of Neil Max Davies. The birth of the dragon Shamat from confusion. Eris/Rs Greek. Strife is the Greek goddess of strife and discord. Her name is the equivalent of Latin discordia, which means discord. Eris' Greek opposite is Harmonia, whose Latin counterpart is Concordia. Homer equated her with the war goddess Enyo, whose Roman counterpart is Bellona. The dwarf planet Eris is named after the goddess. An apple of discord is a reference to the golden apple of discord, Greek, which, according to Greek mythology, the goddess Eris Gia. Strife, tossed in the midst of the feast of the gods at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis as a prize of beauty, thus sparking a vanity-fueled dispute among Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite that eventually led to the Trojan War. For the complete story, see the Judgment of Paris. Thus, apple of discord is used to signify the core, kernel, or crux of an argument, or a small matter that could lead to a bigger dispute. See Rev. 19. Dementia, the terrible goddess of confusion, can turn loved ones into strangers, the proud into the pitiful, the simplest of tasks into ordeals that require impossible feats of heroism. Since childhood she has hated her elder sister Mnemosyne, goddess of memories. Or sometimes, her favorite Midge, she plucks a recollection from the post and hurls it into the present, so that the senile and confused hope to grope abound in a world where memories and events flew battlingly in and without of each other. The pathology of inverted unified dysfunctional cause and effect. The inner condition of a man or woman informs their worldview and actions in this world. It is heart which informs the mind and the mind which observes the world. If one is in darkness of mind and heart, then their perspective is limited to that which is observed only on outward appearances. This is spiritual and intellectual blindness, and is a vulnerability to seeing the world as it actually is. regardless of position and educational level. False perception and latent pride conspires with gained knowledge in an individual, and is misapplied out of its intended context. Thusly, as such, is a corruption of the knowledge base and its application. This leads to negative consequences and micro to macro ripple effects which amplify the resulting feedback loop, aggregating with that of all others, walking in the loud pride, infecting the totality of all creation. The amplifying feedback loop of the loud pride. 1. Gained knowledge base. 2. Pride and arrogance. 3. False perception. 4. False assumptions. 5. Misapplied knowledge. 6. Corrupted actions and outcomes. 7. Micro to macro cascade effects and ripple effect. 8. Triggered blowback effects. 9. Corruption of all creation by influence effect. Bitter fruits of pride, the death of the authentic. The flaccid morbidity of these days is seen in how lies are elevated to the level of truth, and the truth is plundered to fashion the lies which seek to extinguish the very truth it needs to steal to keep itself in existence. In the end, the lies are all exposed by its dependence upon the truth. Thusly, the truth will always win because it needs no lie to be true. Which is quite unlike the lie, which cannot be anything on its own without truth itself. The truth is self-evident and self-sustaining without end. Not so with the lie. Confusion among the nations and peoples is a symptom of a greater malady. Pride. Pride is the malicious code injected into the human experience which corrupts all things. Confusion is a function of taking something out of its original intended context and misapplying it in a faulty context. That is precisely what a lie is. A lie is not the absence of truth, but rather a corruption of it by using truth out of its originally intended context and misapplying it in pride wrongly. Thusly, the end state as such of a person or a nation which is in the lie become the architects of their own demise, ensuring the truth in the phrase, "Pride comes before a fall." One cannot be freed from the confusion without first admitting they are confused. Likewise, one cannot be freed from the tyranny of lies and deception without first seeing that they are in fact enslaved to and serving a lie which will ultimately bring them to their destruction. What is the most valuable thing in a world of fake? Being real. Something the world needs more of. Something civil governance needs more of. Burn the scripts. Say what mean and mean what you say. Otherwise you are only keeping the whole mirage going, making it a prison. What is the most valuable thing in a world of lies? Truth. Something most people demand of others while hiding from it themselves. Now, ask yourselves honestly why it is everyone feels compelled to be on social media. Is it not simply to promote oneself? We shuffle data around like trained circus monkeys on a treadmill, don't we? The actual statistics show just how absurd all this really is. Is this not a facsimile of the real? Do we not get rewarded for complicity, not authenticity? You know, rewarded by that little dopamine burst when people approve of some post or share it. This is but simulacrum. Plastic key folly. How often do we actually take the time to consider the ideas put forth beyond our search for our next socknet hormone hit? We are always selling something, promoting something, never stopping to think that we are merely trained monkeys feeding the digital moguls more money as they sell out data to the highest bidders. We are all merchandise whose lives and time online is bought and sold like cheap candy in the checkout line at a convenience store. We live in a simulation of the real. The digital simulacrum. We are owned by it. Informed by it. Controlled by it and addicted to it. And what do we actually gain by this futilitude of existence? Are we more informed? Are we more rational and sensible people for it? Tell me, are we more kind and respectful of others because of it? I think not. Look around you. We are atrophying into automated singular bubbles of self-obsessed shadows of the real. This is life in the utopian digital republic of Unicornia. A mirage that is more in tune with an Orwellian nightmare mixed with Huxley's Brave New World. It is like in its utter absurdity. We live in the shadowland of intellect and spiritual authenticity, placated by the next thing we wish to buy in a pursuit of happiness, which always remains just out of reach, telling us the next person, place or thing will be the one that grants us happiness. But look at what we have become. Prisons unto ourselves. Echo chambers whose thoughts and ideas bounce off the walls of everyone else's echo chambers, filling our empty spaces with unintelligible noise. The cognitive dissonance is deafening as much as it is distorting in our digital fortresses. The sound of silence is terrifying to us, as would seem. For the noise is often more comforting than the lack of might possibly reveal. Yet without it we cannot hear one another. Only the noise of competing voices and emotive frequencies, all jumbled up and mixed together with static. Confirmation bias of fear-driven self-derivatives. The heteroboth conundrum. Most see reality through the lens of the hetero paradigm or the both and paradigm. What a conundrum for each. Both are doing the very things which they accuse the other of. A false absolutist thinking. What if the use of the two together are actually one unified contextually correct perspective? So it is with deductive and inductive, strategic and tactical, macro and micro perception. Use of one does not presuppose the absence or vital need of the other. It is out of these modalities false assumptions and confirmation bias do so find their genesis, continuance and ultimately their consequences. Worldview, context, logical active frameworks matter. The outworking. We accuse. We bitch. We complain. We post and we interact. But we rarely hear one another through the noise. What we do hear is often filtered through preconceived notions which stand guard at our ear gates. Thusly, when someone appears to be a liar when they may have simply made a mistake. Why? Because it makes us feel better than others for a brief moment, allowing us to hide our own weakness, which if exposed might bruise our fragile egos veiled from public view by movie set like foreign walls of self-righteousness. Now that is anything but living a real life. But fear keeps us doing it so we can get the next promotion or big deal. Welcome to the simulacrum. The pathology of the binary simulacrum. Neither side cannot maintain its delusion without creating conditions for self-referential validation. Thusly they accuse, slander and provoke a scapegoat, the other side, until the targeted scapegoat responds in blowback on the initial side, thereby unintentionally validating the initiator's distorted perceptions, allowing them to self-justify their original actions against the scapegoat in a self-referential internal false narrative. Manufactured blowback from the extremes. Starts on one side of the extreme of the polarity greater than, eventually triggers a dual cyclical downward spiral in the binary. Both sides of the binary engage in this. Both sides play the victim as they accuse, slander, dehumanize and victimize one another. Both sides provoke one another. They see the separation of powers and the necessary checks and balances mechanism in the nation as an obstacle which they seek to dismantle. The result is lawlessness, unbridled corruption, suffering and destruction. Micro-macro inversion triggering, how the illusionaries use the false magic of specific events as diversion to create the illusion of appearances and cover their actual intent and actions. While Americans are arguing and fighting one another, the diversion created emboldens those who are the enemies of all people, including the very ones being pitted against one another from the extremes. It is a classic tactic in waging proxy-driven hybrid warfare. It weakens the opponent by using them against themselves while taking advantage of the chaos to achieve tactical and strategic objectives elsewhere. It is patterned and algorithmic in nature when seen in the broader context of the psychosocial, geopolitical and economic reality. The event-specific myopa-theater focusing on the micros like a magician directs the attention of the audience into a narrow band knowing that they are trying to figure out the trick. The magician uses that to actually trick them. So in looking for the trick, the audience is actually being tricked by magician, who both counts on them to do so and so has diverted them in such a way as to deceive them using their own logic and perceptions against them to create the illusion, which then shocks the audience. Likewise, the malicious code does a similar thing in the micros, individuals, and macros, the nation-state, using diversion tactics, event triggering and confirmation bias to deceive both people and nations. As it is for people, so it is for nations, the entropy of the lie. Our foes are extremely clever. They are extremely adaptive and appear to always be one step ahead. But this too is but smoke and mirrors meant to demoralize and wear down. Knowing that people are en masse easily manipulated due to short attention spans, the fast pace of the high-tech world, basic day-to-day responsibilities and realities, the magicians of national and geopolitical illusion are able to socially engineer cause and effect triggering by hyper-focusing the public on specific news cycle events which act upon the divided collective consciousness of the nation as a means of diversion, furthering the malicious code's macro-level to micro-deceptions. This takes on a life of its own as the feedback loops of the binary become mutually self-perpetuating with little active measures involved but to occasionally add additional fuel to the flame through increasing the propaganda flow to one or both sides of the extreme binary, which in fact are working in concert together from the extreme polarities to create the binary oppositional algorithmic downward spiral attempting to bring all people towards their destruction as the nation atrophies and fractures to a point of terminal effect. Meanwhile, the nation's enemies use this to achieve their strategic and tactical goals, chief among these being the managed degrading of the nation to stand against them even as the nation is devoured and diminished exponentially in power and influence globally, allowing for power, wealth and influence to be siphoned off to the very ones who intend on replacing them for machinacious and corrupt reasons. It is an inherently beast-like paradigm here. The strategy is a form of unrestricted warfare waged in secret until the targeted peoples, tribes and nations are subdued and subjugated to their enemies as slaves. The illusionaries even use their own plans and intents in a weaponized projective tactical as part of their weaponized narrative planted in the targeted country in a kind of macro-level displacement, transference and projective mechanism. In this way they are in fact telegraphing what they have been doing, are presently doing and planning to do, hidden in plain sight albeit in a clever projected inversion. Thusly you can see how the enemies of the out nation are in fact fully co-opted by the same malicious coding in its advanced state and goal. Tyranny in various autocratic constructs. The most obvious nation-state example of this is seen in the North Korean regime and in dictatorial soft-power autocratic regimes like Russia and China. They utilize the soft power approach only until such time as they have gained a critical mass of power, wealth and control. In doing so they have blinded themselves to their own vulnerabilities, which fuels their own fear from the position of their pride, which always precedes their fall by nature of their own decisions, which exposes them and manufactures their eventual self-destruction. Great to then see the micro-macro influences and effects mind maps. Contextual reality check. I don't reveal what I reveal in a vacuum of pure emotion nor detached analytics. I am deadly accurate predicting trends and their outcomes if course correction is not brought to bear. If people want solutions that work for both sides, we stand ready. If not, we will just as easily fight a terror both sides until they are out of way, so we can do what needs to be done for the benefit of all people, even those who are in the way and accuse us. This is reality. We can come together in the middle ground and work together, or the consequences of not doing so will scale exponentially until both sides of the equation are not longer able to remain an obstacle to addressing these problems which are afflicting so many people, tribes, tongues and nations. We are past political wing mixtures and confirmation biases. We are for olive branches or the sword to both sides. We are thoughtful and rational people who want to focus on solutions, not remain ensnared in the manufactured futilitudes of the polarity. A new age of desolation, the abolition of reason and humility. America. Your new age is not new, but rather a repackaging of every unlearned lesson from the past dressed up like a prostitute and a mob boss. Thus will be the consequences thereof. Oh, how the mighty will fall, like the stars from the heavens above. No nation is so powerful or so good that it has the right to be arrogant in what it has and does. We must be willing to see the good and the bad in ourselves and others, and in the nation and other nations at large. As it is for people, so too it is for the nations. Max Davies. My statement does not mean all people in our nations have gone that way. It does mean that those who are having a corrosive and corruptive influence upon the nation and will pay a very steep price for their greed-fueled choices, regardless of how high up or low down they may be on the socio-economic and political power scales. Everything is not simply a matter of hostile foreign influences. In fact, the greatest threats to this nation come from those who compromised with evil and conspired to make merchandise of the people to serve their greed and graft. That is not a political party statement, it is a politically agnostic one on human nature and the corruption thereof. Case in point. I am for both the prosecution of corporate interests as well as criminal organizations that have committed and are committing crimes against humanity through obscurantism and cannibal profiteering on the problems within the society they are guilty of sowing here. That is a singular example of a long list which has been compiled of examples along with the cascade effects thereof. I love my nation and I love my family, friends and the citizens of this nation enough to be blunt about the predicament with which we find ourselves in. I cannot sit by and turn a blind eye to our national degradation while people suffer unjustly and delusion reigns in the populace. Make no mistake, I do not stand alone in this. There is a higher law than that of the civil laws which in many cases the civil authorities have failed to enforce rightly or have slanted to favor the corrupt. The higher law demands action and recompense or the unsheathing of the sword to enforce compliance to its demands for the sake of the law-abiding. When the civil authorities depart from the higher law to stumble down a stony path of their own making, they quickly forfeit their authority to the higher law and justice does come upon all for the benefit of all. The civil authorities were established to uphold the higher law and the laws of the land for the benefit of all law-abiding citizens. When any elements arise to subvert the laws of the land to make them complicit to lawlessness, then consequences scale quickly until the errors are mitigated and righted, or the compromised civil authorities are removed through great tumult and upheaval, causing great distress among all citizens, forcing them from their slumber and complacency towards a compulsion in action. Sometimes those actions, when compelled too late, result in internal confrontation and/or external threats which rise up to take advantage of the subsequent entropy resident in the society, worsening the consequences to the society at large. We are reaching a point where the internal and external pressures upon the Republic are such that we are at a crossroads. A crossroads which will force the people and its leaders to make a decision upon whether they serve a lie or truth, whether they desire righteousness and justice, or the consequences of denying both for the short-term gain of lawlessness. This nation must decide. It is no longer sufficient for its moneyed elite and leadership in both public and private sectors to continue deeper into the delusions which grips the country and devours its people. The binary simulacrum will no longer suffice in staving off the rising consequences, which even now stand at the door waiting to render what is justly due. A decision must be made rightly for the good of the Republic and its citizens, or wrongly for the doom of the great experiment. Nothing is hidden in the light, nor under the presumed cover of darkness. All there is left is the decision. I have long been under the radar observing and documenting what has been going on here in my nation. It is an amazing nation filled with many incredibly talented and good-hearted people whom have been manipulated, merchandised like cattle and misled. It is a nation has been mismanaged and taken advantage of by the unprincipled and wicked whom, having done what right in their own eyes, are clearly now see to have been foolish. It is these who I speak the most harshly to. It is these whose fall will be great and terrible. It is these selfish, brutish and blind ones who have sown the wind and will reap a harvest of both in the whirlwind for their deeds. It is these who even now are in a trap of their own making which they sought to make for all others. It is these whom I fight contention with and stand against and will have victory over. Thusly I write these things in hopes that a few will awake and turn from their way and become part of the way forward rather than remaining as an obstacle to repentance, reconciliation, and restoration of the nation and its people. As I have said, love sometimes has to be tough in tough times, and these times are indeed that, my friends. Some might be tempted to think that what I speak of is a demand for perfection. They would be quite wrong. Only God Almighty is perfect. I have never met a perfectly infallible individual. This of course holds true for the visage I strain to recognize in the mirror every morning. That being myself. For if I am prone to fallibility, who am I to demand it from others? To do so would be soaking my soul in hypocrisy with highly flammable accelerative pride. No, what I speak of is grace. A willingness to forgive others for what they do frees the forgiver from the greater enslavement of pride, bitterness and wrath. We all make mistakes and knowingly do things which harm ourselves and others. Sometimes, dare I say, most of the time, we find ourselves in need of understanding and forgiveness. I have yet to ever meet a person who never made a mistake or did something wrong which affected others adversely. I have met quite a few whom, when faced with the effects of their decisions and actions upon others, blatantly denied even the most remote possibility of having done something harmful intentionally or not to others. In fact, these same ones have most often accused others of being the perpetrators of any harmful things that might have occurred. Here we see the sickly pale moonlight of presenting the reality of something in false light. There once again the dark spectre of pride. It shifts responsibility of guilt to those who are not. It slanders and accuses to fuel its engine of pride steamrolling over the unsuspecting or wronged. Some might think that by giving grace and forgiving others, the latter example of the unrepentant arrogant person will not suffer any consequences. Here I will say they already are. The fact that they are using such tactics to deny their own culpability in such matters is in fact an indicator they are already under the burden of guilt and shame. For if they were not, they would not be so quick to place the blame on other persons, places or things. Even so, grace is not a free pass. One can at once grant the grace of forgiveness while exercising tough love by allowing God to render the final consequences. Sometimes God uses governments. Other times he utilizes situations which arise in the individual's life to break the hold of their pride. Sometimes he simply removes all protective restraints upon them as well as those around them, allowing them both to be agents of destruction upon one another, causing them both great hardship and suffering. One can hate the sin and love the sinner. God knows that we all play both those roles at any given time in our daily lives. It is pride to think we are above it. We must be honest here with ourselves and one another. Now, with all of this said, I do not intend to come off as though I am without pride myself. I fight it daily in my own life. Pride and the insecurity which it often brings is endemic. I too both hate pride in others and struggle with it in my own mortal coils. What I am speaking of needing and exercising, my dear friends, is humility. A humbleness to see and admit when one has fallen short of the impossible standard we call perfection. Dare I ask, rhetorically of course, what actual comprehension of perfection can imperfect creatures grasp, being that we all are so vulnerable to the influences of our own and that of others' lack of it? Is it not a better course for one and for all to give grace to others in at least as much a measure as we each desperately need for ourselves? Grace. What we all need. What we often demand others grant us, even as we so miserly dole it out to them. How troublesome we all are. How quarrelsome we all can be. Don't you agree? Thusly, how can such creatures demand perfection of others when we each are so far from it and comprehension of what it actually is in the here and now? Yet somehow when we see misty-eyed glimpses of what it might be, we tend to recoil from it, if for no other reason than our own insufficiencies, which somehow seem outed by even the briefest of distant reveals of it. It would seem that the glory of perfection does in fact reveal that we all are quite lacking of it within our own lives. That is, if we are willing to admit it. Most are not. This is so because they fear the slightest challenge to their fig-leafed self-delusions that they are themselves beyond reproach on various matters, potentially being themselves as fallible as the next guy. This is the dark abyss of pride. Yes. The kind of pride which demands of others what they themselves are quite unwilling to live up personally, even as they go about crucifying their fellow humans. In fact, entire societies are built around these types of pitiful fools, whose pride are so great that it demands that all of humanity genuflect before it. We call them tyrants, do we not? For they put entire nations into chains to serve their bottomless pit lust for power, wealth, and, here let it be said plainly, worship. They wish to force their fellow citizens to worship them, even as they, in near infinite pride, worship themselves. In doing so they devour their mortal lives, forcing them to be complicit with their own evil. Such is the vow of the tyrant. One does not have to be a dictator to have the same disposition. Oh no. The tyrant's regime always has a hierarchy, or rather lowerarchy, whose malignant governing ways expands until it has total control over all parts of the 7 spheres of influence with which to grow replications of itself in the same matter one grows food and fields as sustenance to feed upon. Thus is the end goal of these sick ones deluded into believing they are masters of all. Yet even these despotic pride-laden fools are but slaves to more powerful powers, who merely use them as their proxies to do their own bidding, which is in fact to fulfill a desire to force the peoples, tribes and nations worship them like God in order to justify destroying them, because their prey are already closer to being like God even in their lowest order selves than these fallen ethereal creatures will ever obtain, even if 1,000 eternities should pass. You see, all human beings were and are made in the image of a perfect God. The one true God made humanity in his image. It is these deceitful fallen creatures which hate this fact, and so set about to deceive and then ensnare humanity that they might be remade in corruption what God made in perfection. Thusly these dark powers deceive humanity into all manner of things with which to corrupt them, enslave them, and then use them as proxy slave warriors against those who are not. But alas, these proxies would not say that they are slaves. Oh no, they in fact would say we are, and they are the free ones. They claim to be free of laws and restraints which they so flippantly impose on all others. They are deceived. They are the greatest of slaves, because they know not they are in fact in the dark chains of a great manipulation. A terrible lie. A monstrous deception which has blinded their minds to their predicament, gifting them the temporary in exchange for their infinite souls. Their end state is the absolute and complete surrendering of their godlikeness to the wretched visage of eternal spiritual deformity and everlasting hellish malady. It is this great deception which causes both the enslaved and the slave masters to fear and even ragingly hate anything which might expose their depravity and desolation born of their unshakable pridefulness. To these pitiful creatures one can see what becomes of those who remain in the despotic grasp of their pride. It is rather like looking through the decrepit gates of hell itself, seeing the beginning of their infinite journey into the tortures of an abominable eternal state of despair and lostness. What is their end state? Cannibalism. Having denied the source of life in this world and the next, their existence in the next will be one which forces them to eat the rot of this world which they departed from. What this means is that after enslaving and devouring those people, places and things here in this world, trying to fill their bottomless pit souls with something to satisfy the ever-growing demands of the lie which they served, their existence in the next world will be enslavement to the devouring of dying mortal flesh, to simply exist with no hope of ever escaping their demonic infinite appetitive desires, nor obtaining the least measure of satisfaction. All this while existing in a horrific state of being burned by their forever never met desires. They will have become then what their own shadows were in this world, always cast to the dust, never to rise again in the light of truth. The light of the truth will have become a devouring fire upon such phantoms once human. Calling a lie truth does not make it more true the more one repeats it, any more than denying the truth makes it less true the more one denies it. What it does do is deepen the hold of the lie upon the mind, body and soul of those who claim it is their truth, even as it furthers them ever downward into the abyss which is their forfeiture of both all they have gained in this world as well as that in the eternal world which follows this one. Even so, those whose pride is greater than their desire to be free from it are humans transitioning into demonhood. They are but being conformed to the image of this world which is one of death. So at death they have become the ghastly contorted shadows of what they once were and will forever be reminded of. They loved their lives solely for the temporary, and thusly will have left all their temporary gains behind when they breath their last breath. Here is where such people will deny anything beyond the temporary. It does make quite good sense to them to deny the hereafter if they have invested everything in the temporary present here now, doesn't it? After all, it is their gospel. It is their doctrine. It is why they fear death more than anything other than their pride being stripped from them. However, when they die they will indeed go into that eternal night with their pride having no excuse, and nothing with which to hide it from eternal exposure, having been left with the torture of their ever-present guilt and shame nevertheless. Let it be said of you that you chose the path less traveled, having sought the truth in love that brings about justice and mercy from a humble and contrite heart. For in this way you will have made an eternal difference in the lives of those who are here now and will come after you. As for people, so too it is for the nations. Of Neil Max Davies.